Can fiscal and economic instability lead to political instability and perhaps even civil unrest, which may lead to the rise of authoritarianism? Well, these things have all happened before, and we're here to examine these pieces of history and these historical precedents and tie them into today's situation with our next guest, Hans-Joachim Voth. He is a professor of economics at the University of Zurich. Professor Voth's research areas include economic growth, sovereign debt, the causes and consequences of the Nazi Party's rise to power, and the Industrial Revolution. Professor Voth has published 3 books and several articles in top economic journals, including the American Economic Review, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and the Journal of Political Economy. Professor Voth has received his doctorate and master's from the University of Oxford. Professor Voth, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on Kitco for the first time. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, David.
Dr. Voth, let's talk about the work that you've done on what it means when budget deficits and other fiscal instabilities have done for the political regimes of their time.
Yeah, so together with a colleague of mine, we looked at the last 100 years of budget cuts. So when a government feels that they need to do something to get the deficit under control, balance the budget, and they start to cut expenditure. And what we found is a pretty remarkable one-to-one relationship between rises in austerity, cutting expenditure on the one hand, and a broad set of measures of instability, where at one end of the spectrum you have things like revolutions, but you can also have violent demonstrations and things like this. And all of these events that indicate instability become much more likely as you cut expenditure and you basically make especially poor people less well off, creating unhappiness.
Sorry, are you saying budget cuts have made poor people less well off?
Yeah, that's what austerity typically means. You cut welfare programs because that's the thing you can cut.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That makes people unhappy, and you end up with anything from rioting in the streets to full attempts at regime overthrow. We've done that for a whole set of countries for the last 100 years, and the relationship is pretty strong.
One could argue, and please refute this theory if you don't believe in it, but one could argue that spending or overspending by the government, so the opposite of budget cuts, have led to rises in inflation, out of control spirals of price hikes, and that in itself has caused civil unrest, instability amongst the populace as the poor get poorer through inflation.
Yeah, that would make sense. It's just not something that you really see in the data. So what happens in these places, what happens with inflation? Inflation happens if you have more people having nominal claims than there's actually goods out there. So everybody's trying to spend, and there's more consumption power out there than the supply of goods that balances this at yesteryear's prices. So then the only way to balance supply and demand is to basically increase prices and reduce the real spending power that people have. So it's a sign of political weakness, typically, that inflation takes off. This is, for example, what you saw in Germany in the early 20s, resulting in one of the most famous and spectacular episodes of hyperinflation. The government knew what was going on. It was obvious because it took years to unfold and go from, relatively modest inflation to the full-scale horror of prices changing by the minute. And the reason why they never did anything about this is that they were incredibly afraid that the communists, but also the right-wing parties at the time, would stage a revolution and just sweep away the newly founded democratic regime running Germany at the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, can we expand on that? So let's talk about your work on how the Nazis rose to power and exactly how the fiscal policies of the Weimar Republic led to the rise of Hitler.
Okay, so first of all, the rise of the Nazi Party, really big topic.
Yes.
Lots of things contribute to it, including some pretty deep-rooted historical things that I've also worked on. But
specifically on the fiscal side, yeah.
Yes, exactly, on the fiscal and the economic side, right? So there's always been the suspicion that there's got to be something to do with the economics of it, right? Because it happens in the Great Depression. Germany has the second worst Great Depression, or depending on how you count it, the worst Great Depression on record. So in the time series, it's totally clear that the Nazi rise coincides with economic misery on a gigantic scale. And During this time, you have major austerity. So that's not my own research. Chris Meissner, with co-authors, has worked on this. And they basically show that in those parts of Germany where the government cuts expenditure the most, you see the biggest increases in support for the Nazi party. What I've done with some collaborators is to look at bank instability. Bank instability is partly a result of this austerity package, partly because the government doesn't intervene as much and prop up the banks as they would like because they're committed to the gold standard, which turns out to be a disaster. The banks fail. And in those areas most affected by that banking failure, by those bank failures, you see the biggest rises in Nazi support. Now, there's obviously a direct mapping from bank failure to economic misery. But then there's an interesting twist on top of this, which taps right into the sort of Nazi playbook. So there's two banks that fail, but only one has a really prominent German Jewish banker leading the bank, at least in the perception of the public. And it's where this bank fails and has branches affecting local people that you see the biggest rise in support for the Nazi party. So what it really does is it helps them sell a sort of hate narrative, saying, we always told you, as one super anti-Semitic newspaper had on its front page, the Jews are our misfortune. And here's the proof, here's the bank that takes down Germany in the middle of the Great Depression, making things even worse. And where there's regional variation in this, you can actually see that the Nazis have a particularly good time actually after the big banking crisis of 1931 in Germany, become the single biggest party in parliament.
Well, it wasn't that the banking crisis led to anti-Semitism. That was already there. The party used that as an excuse, correct?
That's right. I mean, anti-Semites are always a minority. It's a bunch of weird people having kind of strange conspiracy theories. But the question is, how do you get people to sign up to what is essentially an ultra-extremist program? And what you see and what the Nazis themselves think is happening as the crisis unfolds, that this narrative that they've been spinning, this hate narrative about the Jews conspiring with the elites of democratic Germany against the ordinary workers, the normal shopkeepers, and so forth, that gains credibility and basically gains them a place at the table because it starts to sound plausible.
Okay. Well, there's another economic school of thought where that states like excessive government intervention. I'm not saying that budget cuts are a form of non-intervention, but just on the other extreme, where you provide too much welfare, where the state becomes a welfare state, that not only de-incentivizes people to become productive members of society, it also leads to communism and authoritarianism in its own path. Is that something that you've done research on?
Yeah, I mean, that hypothesis is out there, and I've never sort of done a really big picture study as we've done on austerity and unrest. I don't really buy this, okay? So the modern welfare state is one of the great wonders of the modern age. It's raised millions of people out of prime poverty. It has some rough edges, and the costs of it are certainly there everywhere. But you can see its effect in all sorts of surprising ways. So I've just finished research, for example, with a collaborator of mine, where we've looked at the biggest expansion of the federal government in the history of the United States. In the 1930s, the New Deal, the kind of thing that the libertarians hate. And there's some variation in who gets more welfare spending than others, especially in the Midwest, especially farmers, especially areas hit by the Dust Bowl. They really get a lot of support. And then 1941 comes along. Japan attacks the United States. So who are the people who do really costly actions benefiting the country? Who volunteers? Who buys war bonds? Who gets medals, which in most cases means they got themselves killed? It's the people in the areas that receive the highest amount of welfare spending. So there's a sort of interesting, almost reciprocity between people receiving support and feeling members of this bigger entity, which ultimately is an imaginary community, and then reciprocating towards it, doing really costly things.
Is there a correlation between the level of austerity and economic prosperity of the nation? I know economic prosperity is a pretty loosely defined term, and one could measure that in a number of ways, but according to how you would define it, is there a relationship between austerity and prosperity?
Yeah, and it's probably inverse, right? So politicians always want to spend, right? And we understand that for many bad reasons. Typically, they like to sort of spend in order to ensure that they're going to be reelected next time. So having to cut spending is the last thing they want to do, makes people very unhappy. Probably for every unit you take away, you make more people unhappy than you ever made happy in the first place. And it's only when their hand is forced, when there's hard times, that you get austerity and spending. There's basically no spending cuts without extreme economic crisis in the background. It's been tried and tried again, but even very determined conservatives like Maggie Thatcher really never really rolled back the state on any significant scale. If there's one major force in the long sweep of history, it's the rise of the share of the government in GDP. And for the most part, this is actually for the economic good, right? It's the rich countries that tax a lot and spend a lot. And there's good reasons to think that that relationship is causal.
Well, surely there are ways that the government can spend that are more productive than others. I mean, spending is one thing, austerity is one thing, but if you spend unproductively, that's also bad, right?
Sure, many governments do things that are not looking particularly attractive or sensible, but so does the private sector, let's be honest. And there's a sort of additional side that people often don't think about. But having high tax rates, especially high uniform tax rates, is often a good thing for growth. Why? Because it ensures that only the most productive firms survive. So a very large part of the economy at any one moment in time is actually not that productive. You have a handful of firms that are doing really well, they're super productive. And what happens with economic growth is that we move a lot of the resources that the bad firms use, labor, but also land and capital, we move that away from them towards the good firms. And you can do that in a variety of ways. You can just find a way to make the bad firms go out of business. And that happens often when you open up to trade. But the government taxing a lot and uniformly also means that those bad firms have a harder time making a profit, paying their bills. And if they go out of business, and those resources go to the good firms, that's good for everyone. That raises productivity.
Interesting. All right, let's talk about taxes for a minute. So I've got two questions on taxes. The first, what are your thoughts on the proposed global minimum corporate tax rate of 15% amongst OECD nations? What is this going to do to the economies of those participating nations?
Well, it's good for some and bad for others. So the country I live in, Switzerland, is not happy about this because they always felt that they had this particular combination of low taxes and pretty decent public services that attracted a lot of companies. I guess there's countries in the Caribbean that are also pretty unhappy because basically being a conduit for tax fraud has been their main business model. You can be in two minds about this. So I think having high minimum tax rates globally, given that public good provision is not uniform, doesn't strike me as a compelling idea. So there's some benefit to different geographical entities choosing a combination of what they offer and what they ask for in terms of taxes. Within each country, you want uniformity. The tax rate is the tax rate, and nobody gets around it just because he knows politician X. Now, the extra taxes that the rich countries are going to get from this, is the large ones, I'm not sure they're going to pay for a great deal, right? Because these taxes on businesses at the end of the day don't raise very much, and most of them are pretty distortionary because we know that taxation should mostly be at the level of the person and not the company.
Okay. How do you respond to economic theories that posit that there are optimal levels of taxation such that government revenues can be maximized? I'm referring to the Laffer curve posited by Arthur Laffer, who was on the Economic Council of Advisors for Ronald Reagan. And he's a supply-side economist. And his theory is that at a certain point for any economy at any given time, there's an optimal point in which the tax rate, the rate of taxation, not the overall taxes, but the rate of taxation could optimize revenues generated for the government. Is this a theory that you subscribe to?
Well, look, the Laffer curve is a certainty, right? It's a mathematical certainty because if I have zero taxes, then my revenue is zero. If I have 100% tax rate, my revenue is also zero because nobody's going to do anything. So there's got to be a rate somewhere between 0 and 100 at which I maximize revenue. So in that sense, it's not controversial. Everybody knows that this curve exists. The only question is, over the relevant range where most countries are, where the tax take of the government is 30, 40, 50%, if you cut rates, does revenue go up or not? Right? That is the implication of the Laffer argument. That's this idea he sold to Reagan. And the jury is very much out on this one. So the empirics of cutting rates and then the tax revenue will sort of come. I don't see a great deal of empirical support for that.
All right. Well, let's talk about the U.S. in particular, and what the country here can do to, I guess, make the economy better for the average American. Again, very broad term, better, the word better. But let's talk specifically about inflation. That is a concern for everybody, especially the middle class. They're seeing the most impact on discretionary spending and, of course, their appetite to spend because of inflation. What would you do if you were in Congress? Not the Federal Reserve, but if you were in Congress, what would you do? What policies would you implement to combat inflation?
Well, spending's got to come down. I mean, this is, it's not Weimar, but as a result of the COVID crisis, the US government and other governments have been spending right, left, and center. And as John Cochrane has been saying, obviously that money goes somewhere. Inflation is a monetary phenomenon. If you hand out trillions of dollars, they start chasing goods, that's going to raise prices. And you can basically bring down real spending either by cutting nominal spending, or you can let inflation do the job, and then real spending goes down because every dollar that you're trying to spend is worth less. And at the moment, what's happening is the second thing. If you really think that inflation in its own right is a terrible thing, then you have to do the first, because I don't think that the Federal Reserve is really behind the surge in inflation that we see at the moment. Sure, higher policy rates would have helped. They could have done something a year ago, but especially in the US with these amazing spending programs, it's very clear that there's some fiscal push here behind this.
If you think that spending should come down, let's assume that they will cut spending, not to the point of extreme austerity, but if they reduce spending, given our conversation in the earlier part of the interview, does that relationship hold that we are heading towards a more authoritarian regime? Is that too simplistic an argument to make?
Yeah, look, so the thing that we studied, the reason why we looked at many countries in 100 years of data, is that unrest and instability is a little bit like a forest fire. Okay. So people throw matches into the forest all the time and nothing happens. But at some point, the forest is dry. It hasn't rained for months. And the same match that you could have thrown a year ago that did nothing suddenly gives you a huge conflagration. And that's a little bit what happens in societies. There's economic shocks that make the forest dry. Austerity is one of those that seems to be very effective. And you can detect it if you have a lot of data, many countries, many periods. There's no certainty and no one-to-one mapping in any of these things. Not many things have to go wrong before you can think that something dramatic might happen. And is that thing, cutting spending to get inflation under control, austerity? Maybe yes, maybe no. I'm not going to tell you that, it's going to happen by December. Does it raise the probability of something going wrong? Yes, probably combined with interest rates going up. And then once you have a recession, getting out of it takes time and a lot of stimulus and comes with all sorts of extra baggage. And that might be the time when everything's going to hell when you have the next election.
Okay. All right. Well, okay, let's talk about exactly what the government is doing wrong currently that I guess is either exacerbating inflation or hindering economic growth. I know you've touched on spending, but like you said, sometimes spending is necessary, especially during extreme circumstances, shall we say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not so sure that the Biden administration is doing such a terrible job. I mean, they were handed a pretty tough hand to play. And clearly prioritizing weaker parts of society is something that you want to do in developed civilized countries. The US has a much smaller welfare and transfer system than other countries at similar levels of income. Now, Could it be doing better? Probably. There's a lot of tax exemptions that haven't been touched in the recent reshuffles, right? Carried interest issues and stuff like that. There could be much better ways of raising revenue. I'm not necessarily against protecting some of those extra transfers that were brought in. But it's pretty clear if you take a sort of global perspective, and this is not just true of the United States, that TFP growth has slowed. Overall growth has slowed a lot. And one of the things we're no longer really doing is public investment in infrastructure, but also more public spending on just R&D and education and so forth. All of these numbers compared to the 60s are down an awfully long way. And every evidence that I've seen as an economist would suggest that these would have very high rates of return. So finding any way to shift some of that licking the ice cream today kind of public spending towards investing towards the future, and not just because you put some sticker on it that suggests that it makes the future better, but actually sort of puts high-speed rail in the ground and gets roads that don't look like testing sites for landmines, which the rest of the world is laughing about, and stuff like that, must be a winner.
All right. I'd like to talk about your research on debt and how that impacts political regimes. So, as you know, our debt level has been rising, and actually as a percentage of GDP, it's exceeded actually 100%. Actually, it's been sovereign debt in the U.S. has exceeded 100% for a long time. Is this a concern for you, number one? And number two, do you think this could potentially lead to either economic and or political instabilities?
No, I think it's actually fine. I think there's absolutely nothing to worry about. Okay. So first of all, a historical perspective tells you that 100% is not that high, right? So Britain at the end of the Napoleonic Wars had more than 200% debt to GDP. So this is a bunch of guys in tights who thought that steam engines were high tech, and they managed to repay that without any trouble, and actually transformed the economy in a much more fundamental way that we're currently trying to do. I don't think anybody knows what the sustainable or appropriate level of debt is as a fixed rule. There's one simple thing we can say, which is that if you have higher debt levels, you should be running higher primary surpluses. Taking away all the money you spend on the debt, is there something left to actually service that debt that you're accumulating? And if you make more of an effort, then most of the time, if that reaction is big enough, debt is sustainable. And the US, on the whole, has been doing exactly that. So there's many European countries that have debt levels in the same range or even higher. They're doing just fine. There's certainly no major economic or political discontinuity lurking in the background. And there's other countries that at less than half of the current US debt level really went to hell, like Argentina. What's the difference? The difference is what we call state capacity. Do you have a government that actually collects information and then enforces tax rules that ensure that enough revenue is there to pay for that debt? And especially in a time of what used to be until now extremely low interest rates, there was no problem. And there's no conceivable scenario in which the US, especially given the status of the dollar as international reserve currency and prized asset status for US treasuries, is going to have problems rolling over its debt or finding buyers for its bonds.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the current level of sovereign debt is not a problem. So what about the argument, and just hear me out, what about the argument that too high of a debt level would force the Federal Reserve to not be able to fight inflation as effectively? Because the argument is that if you have an insurmountable level of debt, the interest expenses on those debt for future debt payments or future debt issuances rather, especially, that would make it unaffordable for the Treasury to pay back not only the debt, but pay the interest expenses on the debt if the Federal Reserve raises policy rates above a certain level. Hence, the Federal Reserve will be limited in its ability to fight inflation through hiking rates. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's some of that going on, and that's particularly dramatic if you have very short debt maturity, right? So if all your debt matures in 3 months, then the 3 month rate is what you have to worry about. If you need to raise that in order to fight inflation, you're in a spot of trouble. But that's not the case. I mean, the US, like any grown up country, has a very conservative debt maturity structure and issues bonds, a long way out. And most of the inflation fighting that you need right now is barely going to leave a trace in the debt payments that the US owes the rest of the world and itself in the foreseeable future.
Okay. And how do you feel about modern monetary theory, which is a theory that the government can, I'm paraphrasing and I'm simplifying the theory, of course, but the government can basically solve a lot of problems by creating money supply without fear of consequences?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be wonderful. I mean, there's also the yogi flying theory, and it's equally attractive and equally implausible. So,
it is the opposite extreme of what you're describing, which is budget cuts. I mean, in theory, wouldn't you, if budget cuts lead to civil unrest or have in the past led to civil unrest, just theoretically speaking, would you not want the opposite? Would you not want the government to have the ability to spend at infinity, and hence have the money supply to infinity to fund this spending?
Sure. I mean, look, being able to print money is very valuable, and that's one of the things that I like to say to the gold bugs who want the gold standard back, right? The main point of the gold standard is to take away the driver's license of governments and central banks and say, no, 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 no. There's a sort of completely artificially chosen limited quantity of X, and that constrains how much money you can issue, and then everything is going to be better. And I think that's silly, right? That's a very dangerous idea, because in certain moments, it's very valuable that you can actually spend right, left, and center, and that may be better than the alternative. I just don't subscribe to this theory that you can make, in the long run, except in extreme circumstances, anything better by just spending right, left, and center and not worry about the consequences. There doesn't seem to be any empirical support or even any sort of serious theory behind this.
All right. Oh, well, I'd like to close on the gold standard since you brought that up. Yes, taking away the government's driver's license to print. That's a very good analogy. I like that. But just theoretically speaking, of course, what is wrong with bringing back the gold standard, a return to the Bretton Woods, if you want to call it? Would that not stabilize our inflationary troubles all around the world?
Sure, many things would stabilize inflationary troubles. If you shoot every shopkeeper who raises prices, that would probably take care of it too. It means that the shelves are empty. Let's be serious. So the gold standard worked, and it had the sort of golden moment in the second half of the 19th century. And there's some people who sort of feel nostalgia for that period, not entirely without reason. And all the 20th century experience with the gold standard is a disaster. Both Bretton Woods and the interwar gold standard worked incredibly badly and had very significant costs. And there's a very simple conceptual reason why it cannot be made to work today. And here it is. What happened in the 19th century, if you listen to people like Larry White, is exactly right. This autopilot feature of the gold standard meant that money basically flowed from one country to the next because everybody had the same currency. It just put a different sort of sign on it. And then some countries had to reduce prices because their money flowed out. Okay. And that you could do in the 19th century, where jobs typically were sort of from one day to the next. And the foreman at 6 o'clock at the dockyard would say, I need 100 riveters. We're going to pay you, 10 cents an hour. Who wants the job? And next day he could say, we'll pay you 5. Today we have long-term loan contracts, and everything we know says that cutting wages is incredibly hard because it demotivates people. You sort of have to violate a written contract. So basically, in an economy in which you value human capital, in which you have long-term labor contracts, it's almost impossible to really get deflation going, and that's what makes the gold standard sing. The symmetry between deflation and inflation, you can have either depending on the gold flows, and that's just not going to work in a modern economy. It's a pipe dream.
You mentioned that there were problems of past gold standards. Can you highlight what these problems were? Let's not talk about the classical gold standard. Let's talk about a more recent one, like the Bretton Woods system. What were the major problems? I mean, one could argue that during the period of the 50s until 1971, inflation was relatively stable. So what are these problems?
That's right. I mean, look, the Bretton Woods system, if you sort of look at it from 30,000 feet up, looks fantastic, right? There's no banking crises. There's pretty rapid productivity growth, especially in Western Europe, also in the United States. Unemployment's very low. So what's not to like? Now, the thing that people always forget about the Bretton Woods system is that this is a period of extreme financial repression, meaning banks don't do anything. The government sets the interest rate that they're allowed to charge. It sets the interest rate that they're allowed to offer its depositors. They're not really taking any risks. There's not much financial intermediation going on. All equity markets are on a super tight leash. You have the government basically telling labor and the employers what the wage settlements should be. So if you're comfortable with what looks, to modern eyes like a semi-directed socialist economy, then you can make something like the Bretton Woods system work. And even then they had a lot of pressures, right? Because some countries, for all sorts of social reasons, have higher inflationary pressures than others, and you periodically need to revalue things. But let's talk about the interwar period, because we touched on that before. So this banking crisis in 1931 that I was telling you about, that took down two of the largest four German banks, which we argue is one of the key contributors to the rise of the Nazi Party and all of that entailed. The reason why the central bank couldn't rescue them is the gold standard. They wanted to intervene. They wanted to actually offer support, liquidity support to these struggling banks who'd made some bad loans. And the reason why they couldn't is that they were on the gold standard and an international treaty obliged them. So they couldn't just forget about it for a while in an emergency situation. It obliged them to keep a certain gold cover of the currency. And without a loan from either the Bank of England or the Bank of France, they were out of cash. And because of the memories of World War I and the lack of mutual support, those loans were not forthcoming. The central bank ran out of cash. They let the banks fail, and the rest is history. That's what happens if you have a gold standard. You try to run it in what looks like a modern economy.
Mm-hmm. Looking forward, then, do you think cryptocurrencies, or perhaps what we're talking about, some people are talking about a Bitcoin standard, could fix some of the problems, or do some of the things that Bretton Woods has maybe failed to do? Let's put it that way.
To be honest, maybe I'm just old, but I just do not see a single problem that gets solved by cryptocurrencies. Certainly not Bitcoin, which is a disaster environmentally. It's a disaster in terms of transactions, but also Ethereum and all the other cryptocurrencies, they're solutions in search of a problem. And maybe we're going to find some amazing application for it. Clearly, the blockchain has all sorts of attractive attributes, but the idea that this should be replacing money seems completely misguided to me.
Well, that's an interesting point, Professor. Well, some people would argue that the cryptocurrency space has made improvements over time to reduce its environmental footprint. And if you look at the Ethereum merge that's about to happen in the coming weeks, Ethereum is supposed to, post-merge, reduce its carbon emissions by up to 99%. But certainly other people would agree with you that cryptocurrencies are not a replacement for fiat yet. Another topic for another time. But thank you, Professor, for coming on the show. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, David.
And thank you for watching Kitco News. I'm David Lin.